We are very honored and excited to have with us Joan Johns Cobbs, L. Francis Skip Griffin Jr., and Kimberly Jenkins Robinson. So I'll just share a little about each of them. So Joan Marie Johns Cobbs was born in 1938 to Violet and Robert Johns in Darlington Heights, Virginia, a tobacco farming community where she and her siblings tilled the land and sawed down trees to help the family make a living. During her high school years at Robert Russell Moton High School in Farmville, she was part of a student strike led by her sister Barbara to protest conditions at their racially segregated school. Along with her classmates, she became a plaintiff in Davis versus County Board of Supervisors of Prince Edward County, Virginia, one of 5 cases consolidated under the United States Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education. And I just want to note that Joan was 12 years old when she became a part of this litigation. After graduating from high school, she attended Howard University in Washington, D.C. She was later employed. She had a long career with the federal government. And today, she has been really leading the charge in ensuring that this story is not forgotten. And we were just talking earlier about the number of programs that she'll be speaking in this month to ensure that this legacy and its important lessons are remembered. Leslie Skip Griffin Jr., I'm going to refer to him as Skip, although I feel like my grandmother is frowning down on me right now. So Skip has had a extraordinary career. A good portion of it was as an executive with the Boston Globe newspaper, where he served as director of community relations and public affairs. His career also included a stint as associate dean of student affairs and director of the African American Institute at Northeastern University in Boston, where he oversaw and developed programs that played an important role in the improvement of undergraduate and graduate student retention, minority student retention. As we all know, he also has a very significant background in civil rights, community organizing, and community education. He and his siblings were plaintiffs in the landmark school desegregation case, Griffin versus Prince Edward County, Virginia. The case resulted in the reopening of public schools, which had been closed from 1959 to 1964, and helped reverse the effects of Virginia's mass resistance. See, Skip, he attended Harvard College, Harvard University, the other HU, where he also received his Master's of Education Administration at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And then they'll be joined in conversation by Kimberly Jenkins Robinson, who is a professor at the School of Law, as well as a professor at both the School of Education and Human Development and the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. She is one of the nation's leading education law experts and speaks throughout the United States about K-20, education equity, school funding, education and democracy, equal opportunity, civil rights, Title IX, and federalism. In 2023, she launched the Education Rights Institute, which supports scholarship and engagement about a federal right to education, the key building blocks of a high-quality education. The Institute is also focused on the opportunity gaps in the delivery of those building blocks. Kimberly is the author of a couple of books I want to mention here. In 2019, the New York University Press published her edited volume, A Federal Right to Education, a Fundamental Question for Our Democracy. And then in 2015, Harvard Education Press published her book edited with Professor Charles Ogletree of Harvard Law School, entitled The Enduring Legacy of Rodriguez, Creating New Pathways to Equal Education Opportunity. It was in this edited volume that scholars analyzed the impact of the 1972 U.S. Supreme Court decision, San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez, which held that the U.S. Constitution does not protect a right to an education. So with that said, we're going to turn the conversation over to our esteemed panelists to talk about this important history and the unfinished work of Brown and Griffin.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Justin. So we are going to each share just some information, but I, of course, am going to defer first to Joan and Skip to share their stories and their just long contributions to the work of school desegregation and particularly to our communities, and then I will speak at the end. So first to Joan.
Good afternoon. My name is Joan Marie Johns Cobbs, and I was 12 years old when my sister Barbara Rose Johns led 450 students out on a strike for a better school, April 23, 1951. Barbara was only 16 years old at the time. Barbara organized and planned the strike, and she and her fellow classmates met secretly on the athletic field at Robert Russell Moden High School in Farmville, Virginia. Barbara was a junior at the school where the conditions were deplorable. Rather than build a new school for the students, the county decided to build 3 tar paper shacks around the existing high school to accommodate the students. The buildings were cold and drafty and heated with pot-bellied stoves. The students who sat closest to the stove were too hot and the other students were too cold. In the winter months, we often sat in class wearing our coats and boots to keep warm. When it rained, we helped our teachers place pails around the room to catch the water. We had hand-me-down books from the white high school that were tattered and torn. We had no science labs, no gyms, no lockers, no cafeteria, and no school supplies. Our teachers had to buy many items that we needed for school. We had excellent teachers who pushed us to excel and demanded our undivided attention. Barbara decided to go to her favorite teacher, Miss Inez Davenport, who taught both of us music, and she discussed the conditions of the school with her. She listened to Barbara and then said to her, "Well, why don't you do something about it?" Her question surprised Barbara, and she said it did not occur to her to ask her what she meant. And she felt that she had dismissed her with that reply. So Barbara devised a plan that she felt was divinely inspired and summoned her fellow classmates that she trusted, and they coordinated the details of the strike. The morning of April 23, 1951 was a normal school day, but when we were summoned to the auditorium, everything changed. Instead of our principal, M. Boyd Jones, on the stage, there stood my sister Barbara at the lectern. I was so shocked that I slid down in my seat as low as I could go when she started to talk. She explained to us that the conditions at our school were intolerable and that we needed to go on a strike for a better school. She asked us to please cooperate with her and tell our parents to support us. She made it very clear to us that this was the only way that we would get any results. When one of the students asked if we were going to get into trouble for this, she replied that the Farmville jail was not big enough to hold all of us, so we should not worry. Needless to say, we followed her out of school for two weeks. The students had devised a scheme to get our principal out of the school prior to the assembly in the auditorium. One of the students, John Watson, put a handkerchief over his mouth and called the principal's office to tell him that some of his students were downtown when they should have been in school. As soon as the principal left, Barbara sent a note to the teachers to come to the auditorium. She had forged the principal's initials on the note. When they came, she politely asked them to leave. And when one of the male teachers resisted, 2 of the male students led him out of the auditorium. My first reaction to what had occurred was fear. I thought that the white community would try to harm us, and I worried that our parents would discipline us too, even though Barbara had told us that we should not be afraid. I had no idea what the consequences of our actions would be. All that Barbara wanted was to have a better educational facility for us and for us to be treated as equals to the white students. Barbara told our parents what had happened that day. They were very shocked, but their immediate concern was for the safety of Barbara. After receiving threats, they decided they needed to send her away to finish her senior year of high school. She went to live with our Uncle Vernon Johns, pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and a civil rights activist in his own right. Barbara graduated from Alabama State Collegiate Preparatory High School there. After the strike, Barbara realized that we were going to need some support, so she contacted Reverend L. Francis Griffin, pastor of the First Baptist Church in Farmville, Virginia. He is the father of Mr. Griffin, who's sitting on the stage. He got involved and helped the students by providing the best advice that he could. He worked with the NAACP to get the attorneys to represent the students. He also provided his church as a meeting place so that the community could seek and get information on what had happened, what their options were, and how to best handle the situation. Barbara and Carrie Stokes wrote a letter to prominent civil rights attorneys Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson in Richmond, Virginia, to ask for their help. At first, they refused because of their tight schedules. But Barbara then called Oliver Hill, and he said that she was so persistent that they decided to stop through Farmville en route to another place. When they saw how serious the students were, they told them if they could persuade their parents to sign their children as plaintiffs in a suit that would become part of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, then they would help them. 119 parents signed for their children to become plaintiffs in Davis versus Prince Edward County. Barbara wrote a diary about what happened during the strike in 1951 that was found by her husband after she died, September 25th, 1991. I thought it was very interesting, and I would like to share some of the excerpts with you. And I quote, "We were fond of our teachers. My favorite and the one who had the greatest impact on my young life was Ms. Davenport, my music teacher. Besides introducing us to the beauty of classical music, she permitted full expressions in her classes, something quite foreign to most of the classes. Most teachers taught and you listened and responded to their comments when requested. But Miss Davenport felt that everything in life lent itself to a variety of opinions, thoughts, moods, moments, much the same as music. And she encouraged us to respond that way. I got to know her more intimately when she became the music teacher for my sister and I when we took music lessons after class. I felt I could share my innermost thoughts with her, and she wouldn't consider them ridiculous. This is how I happened to mention to her how unhappy I was with the school building and its inadequacies. I told her that it wasn't fair that we had such a poor facility, equipment, etc., when our white counterparts had such a huge facility with an atrium, science labs, a gym, and a cafeteria. I warmed to my subject and looked to her for some answer to my frustration. She paused for a few minutes and then said, "Why don't you do something about it?" I was surprised at her question, but it did not occur to me what she meant. I just slowly turned away as I felt she had dismissed me with that reply. What could one do about such a situation? I had no idea. So I spent many days in my favorite hangout in the woods, on my favorite stump, contemplating it all. I sat by the creek while Sadie Red, who was our family horse, drank, and I thought about it. My imagination would run rampant, and I would dream that some mighty man of great wealth, through God, would build us a new school, or that our parents got together and surprised us with this brand new building. And we had a great celebration. I even imagined that a storm came through and blew down the main building and splattered the tar paper shacks to splinters. And out of this wreckage rose this magnificent building. And all the students were joyous, and even the teachers cried. But then reality would set in, and I would be forced to acknowledge that nothing magical was going to produce us a new school. And then there were times I just prayed, "God, please grant us a new school. Please let us have a warm place to stay where we won't have to keep our coats on all day to stay warm. God, please help us. We are your children too." This type of thinking went on for months. Sometimes as I chopped the wood, sometimes as I fed the pigs, when I did work, or when I sat quietly, it would crop up in my mind because I felt that we were not treated like the other students. They were not cold. They did not have to leave one building and transfer to another. Their buses weren't overcrowded. Their teacher didn't have to make fire before we could start classes. One morning, I was so busy rushing my brothers and sister down the hill to school that I forgot my own lunch and had to rush back up the hill to retrieve it. In the meantime, the bus arrived, picked them up, and left me standing there by the roadside, waiting to thumb a ride with whoever came by. Later, I was still waiting when the white bus drives by, half empty, on its way to Farmville High School. It would have had to pass my school to get to that school, but I couldn't ride with them. Right then and there, I decided that indeed something had to be done about this inequality, but I still didn't know what. All day, my mind and thoughts were whirling, and as I lay in my bed that night, I prayed for help. Whether in a dream or whether I was awake, but I felt I was awake, a plan began to formulate in my mind. A plan that I felt was divinely inspired because I hadn't been able to think of anything until then. That plan was to assemble together the student council members whom I considered the creme de la creme of the school. However, they were smart and they were thinkers. I knew them and I trusted them, and I was a part of them. From this, we would formulate a plan to go on a strike. We would make signs, and I would give a speech stating our dissatisfaction, and we would march out of the school. People would hear us. They would see us and understand our difficulty. They would sympathize with our plight and would grant us our new school. Our teachers would be proud, and the students could learn more, it would be grand and we could live happily ever after. Fully confident that all of this would transpire, I arose the next morning, rushed to get everyone out, and I could hardly wait to get to school to call this meeting. I was self-sufficient and independent because my mother was not around to rely on or to consult. My father was too busy plowing and planting and harvesting to have time for any fantasy of mine. And he would have considered it foolish. He would have never agreed with it, but he would not have stopped me. I was permitted free rein in my thinking and actions. As he put it, I was too stubborn and too determined to have my own way. I didn't consult my Uncle Vernon because he wasn't around, and I felt no need to consult anyone. It had been given to me. All I had to do was do it, unquote. My sister Barbara was a brave, courageous, and fearless young person who saw an injustice and decided to do something about it. She stood up for what she believed, and her actions on April 23rd, 1951, changed the course of the nation when in 1954, the Supreme Court declared that segregated schools were unconstitutional. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan.
So the Prince Edward story unfolds beginning with Barbara and Joan and her contemporaries, and then I was a little boy when this happened, but it changed my family's life because of my father's involvement, and later on I became sort of the second generation, among the second generation of student leaders after the massive resistance and the schools were closed in Virginia, and my sisters and I became plaintiffs in the Griffin versus Prince Edward County. But let me say, as we think about these things, I think this is a rich story, and I say this in the most respectful manner. I've often said to Joan, and I think that this, and I give speeches on this, and I speak to the young women in the audience. If you close your eyes, those of you who are old enough and those of you who have imaginations, and go back to 1951, what in the world could have been going on in the mind of a 16-year-old girl in a chauvinist, racist society to imagine that she could be a leader, to take on something that had been in existence for hundreds of years? I mean, that's an extraordinary act of leadership and courage, and so I now consult and develop leaders, and I often start with this. It's like, whatever change is in the world, it starts within us. And she's the primary example of it. It certainly changed the trajectory of my father's life when they came, and I often asked him why he got involved, why he never left Prince Edward County. And he said it was because of the courage of the students, Barbara and the other students who led the walkout. And it gave him, in the moment it happened, he knew almost immediately that this was going to be his life's work. My grandfather had moved the family from Norfolk, Virginia, because he got tired of big city life in 1922. He came to Farmville. I'm sorry, 1927. He came to Farmville. My father was 10 years old when they moved in 1927. My grandfather pastored First Baptist until he passed away in 1949. The church selected my father to replace him. At first they thought it would be a temporary thing, And then when the young people walked out, he stayed. He never left Prince Edward. It became his life's work. And from as early as I remember, our household was just a hustle and bustle of people. And I thought everybody grew up that way. I didn't know that this wasn't normal, that I didn't realize. So Carl Rowan, who was one of the early black reporters who worked for major white newspapers, was a frequent visitor. Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robertson, Lester Banks, who was the Virginia NAACP executive director, Sam Tucker, who had then joined them, later a young Henry Marsh. Sam Proctor was down at the University of Virginia. He hadn't yet replaced Adam Powell at Abyssinia. Jim Cheeks, who went on to become president of Howard, was a young professor at Virginia Union. And then, of course, Vernon Johns was always in the house. I thought this was normal. And so as a little boy, and they would never run me out of the room. I would sit in the room and listen to these people talk. And so I would hear the stories of what they were trying to do. I couldn't make sense of all of it because they used all these big words. All I knew was listening to them and watching the way people reacted to them and respecting them. I knew that I wanted to be like them when I grew up. So there was quite a bit of joy in the community, and reporters came from the New York Times and other places to talk after 1954. And then there was kind of a winter that set in, and I kept hearing the words. I didn't know what they meant. Later on, as a student, I went back to study also, but I started to make sense of stuff that passed through my mind. In 1956, there started to be talk about what Virginia meant by massive resistance, and the fact that they were going to, not integrate the schools. Harry Byrd, who had been governor and who was then the senator and had one of the more powerful political machines in the country, had decided that Virginia was not going to integrate its schools, and that they were going to resist massively. And so there was talk even as early as 1956 or 57 around the house, but I learned there were things that we could talk about as kids with our friends, and then there were things we couldn't talk about. This was one that we couldn't talk about because as early as 1957 or so, there was talk that maybe there might be school closures to avoid integration. That did occur, but I want to hit the pause button here and say that one of the things is I would talk with my father, and it became apparent to him and to others that I had a sort of appetite for getting involved in this movement thing. He thought that one of the things that Barbara did, he thought she was extraordinary, but one of the things that she did was an example of really good leadership, was early on to engage others. She went and got, was it 8 students, I think? 5, okay. And they each had support from other students. She didn't try to go this alone. She was clearly the leader. And one of the things I try to tell young people is I'm not trying to change your militancy, because I certainly got accused of that. But you run into danger when you act unilaterally, and when you just get up and start speaking yourself. Once you get a glimpse of what's possible and you come to an understanding that you want to play a role, it's really, really important to engage others and to deeply engage them, and that's what she did. And she was very clear about what it is that she wanted, and they, I think, were equally clear. And so the message becomes possible to be amplified. Now, my father learned, and Vernon Johns also taught me, before you start he was kind of forced into acting quickly because the actions that Barbara and the students had. But he had spent his entire life going throughout the county. I know older people used to call it visiting, you know. You just show up at somebody's house with no purpose other than to stop by and look at them, sit a spell, as they would say. And that was my father's, you know, three things he loved to do. He loved to read, and we had so many books in the house, we didn't have anywhere to sit sometimes. And the second thing he loved was hunting, believe it or not, and he was a great hunter. And the third thing that was his hobby is just get in the car and go out to somebody's house in the country and stop by their house and sit with them and talk with them. And Joan says that she remember. He just show up at people's houses, and he did it every day. And I would say, well, when did you build the movement? He said, I built the movement every day. When I was hunting in the woods, I was getting a bunch of guys who liked to hunt knowing me. And when I stopped by people's houses, I was getting them to know me, and I was getting to know them. When I would go out to the country churches and preach, or when I did a wedding or a funeral, all of this was just building myself into the community. And he could tell you where just about every important black person stood on whether they would respond and support the students, and then whether later on they would support the movement that was going on. So when I hear people who just get angry and stand up and start shooting off their mouth, and I mean that, my point is that you have to build a following. You have to have as the kids call it, you have to have a posse. You got to have some homies, you know. And if you know, the movement really depends on, you know, how many homies you got and how deeply committed to the thing you're doing is. And that was his principle for organizing. Every day, every encounter, it wasn't transactional. It was to build deeper alliances with the people. Now, the amazing thing about Prince Edward County is it started with Barbara and the students. They initially wanted a school. They wanted to make separate but equal real. And the attorneys had said they got tired of that because they could fight separate but equal cases for the rest of their lives and nothing would really change. And it was a change in strategy, and the change in strategy was we are going to dismantle legal segregation. And I talked with Oliver Hill about it, and he said, yeah, Joan's right. They were just passing through. They were going to pat the kids on the head and say, okay, you made your point, go on back to school. But when they got there, the enthusiasm and the intelligence and the deep commitment made them think differently. I think they were looking for a case in Danville or somewhere else, one of the bigger towns or cities, and they said, but these kids are here and the people and are deeply committed. So if you look in, there's a picture from the 1951 Baltimore Afro-American. They had a rally in the church. There were so many people in that church. This was pre any mass gathering. It's just amazing that this happened in 1951. And I wasn't there. I was a young boy, but later on I talked to my father and I talked to people and I said, well, what was your message? And I don't know if you remember this. It was a passage, you know, every valley shall be exalted, every mountain will be made low, the crooked places will be made straight, the rough places will be made smooth, and the glory of God shall be revealed. And the title was The Prophecy of Equality. And the parents supported Joan, and she said, you know, this is one of the little known facts of history, how you can do inquiry. 70% of the plaintiffs in Brown versus Board came from Prince Edward County. Okay. And then as massive resistance set in, the Prince Edward County black community, Barry Wall, who owned the Farmville Herald, was one of the chief voices of segregation, used to always end his editorials, Prince Edward County stand steady. And then later on, I was talking to him. Well, I was speaking to the white community, but it looks like the black community stood more study than we did, and they prevailed. And you know, some of my speeches I used to give as young actors. I love Bob Marley, and they did that. He took that song and said, "Fought the law, and the law won." Well, it was different in Prince Edward County because of what Barbara and them did twice. We fought the law, and we won. You know, and so it proved that. But there were all kinds of support. It wasn't just the thing that my father instilled with me is like, get some followers, get your posse. And he would say, even Jesus had 12 disciples, you know, and later 70 that he commissioned to go out. You can't do this thing alone. Part of leadership is having a vision, but it also inspires others to join you in the leadership. And that's what made the Prince Edward thing so successful. Barbara had that style of leadership. My father had that style of leadership. And the community, and I think that whoever it was, Kanan or Justin said, I think there are unique things that happen in the history of a community. I think Israel on the Appomattox, the people there, something got in the spirit. There was a lot of independence, a lot of strong-willed people. Not everybody, but enough so that they would stay with the struggle from 1951 to 1964. That's 13 years. And the one thing I would say to young people is, you think, don't get it twisted. You can't do this level of change in an election cycle. You know, the real change, by the time it gets to the election cycle, it's already mostly changed. It takes years to build this kind of change, and you have to have the patience to do it over time. And I think there are comparative things. Like a lot of people think 1776 America just popped up. The American Revolution was 7 years, and then it was another. You know, the last states that formed the lower 48, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona and Oklahoma didn't become states until 1912. So the United States it has only been the nation, and then Hawaii and Alaska were added in 59, 60. So the truth of the matter is we've only been the United States of America that we know for 64 years. So it's a process. It's always a process. Now, you know, I inferred from something that they said this morning that I don't believe that, see, I think several things are going on that teachers need to think about. De Tocqueville, when he came to America and looked at it, he was amazed at the fact that sometimes in communities, they built schools before they built churches when America was growing and developing. America was committed to public education to make every man a king. I think one of the problems we face now is America's not sure what it believes about public education, although I think they've abandoned it. And I think the battle, not only for equality of education, I think the battle we have to fight now as teachers and citizens and as young people is to preserve education and restore it to the importance that it was in the country when de Tocqueville was writing about American development. Second thing is, I like the notion, I got you. I know I'm a Baptist preacher, what you want, you know. All right, I'm gonna stop. You're a lawyer, I'll leave it to questions. But I think that I like the notion of the direction you were going in, inquiry and using primary sources. I don't believe that teachers should advocate and force their students to be change agents. I think that's dangerous in today's climate, and I'm always mindful of the fact that whatever movement develops, we have to take into account the constraints and the climate in which we're doing. So I like the notion of inquiry, and I'll leave it at that so you can ask questions.
Thank you both very much. I want to just give a hand for Skip. So I am just going to reflect a bit on their remarks and sort of where we are now and where we're headed, and then we're going to have some Q&A. So first, I just want to start with gratitude. And, you know, I moderate a lot of panels, and usually I'm actually quite tough on time and insist on a certain amount, but we're sitting with living history. And I just think there's not, you know, that is not the time to do that. And so I'm really just grateful for the stories that they shared and the ones that we can learn from about how we address our current moment. So I just think it's just important that we hear and listen to these stories so that we can think about how we move forward. So when we think about sort of where we are currently, and we're reflecting on the history of Brown versus Board of Education 70 years later, one of the things that I've been talking about with people is that, you know, even though we sort of broke up with Jim Crow, we still have this love affair happening with Jim Crow. It was one of those breakups where you keep their pictures around, and you might keep their love letters around, and there's sort of this longing for them, but you feel like, well, it wasn't working, you know, at least that's what everyone told me. So, but really in your heart, we kind of held on to it. And one of the ways that we see that, you can see that in the actual ways in which we still have very significant disparities in educational opportunity in our nation. I think it's important that we recognize the progress that we've made, that we do have, you know, significant integration in many places, but we also still have significant disparities in educational opportunity. I'll just give you a data point from that. So a study from the Education Trust looked at funding for public schools, and it said that schools where they have higher concentrations of students of color get about $2,700 less per student, about 16% less. So if you only have a small district, that's not even dealing with the large districts, if you have a small district of 5,000 students, that would be about $13.5 million in missing resources. Obviously double that if you have a district of 10,000 and on. And so what we see is that we still have these significant disparities in funding that were in place before Brown versus Board of Education. We had unequal schools in which the funding gaps caused disparities in things like facilities, caused disparities in things like the resources that are available in the classroom. And today, we often still have significant disparities in educational opportunity. That's true also for students who are learning English. When you have significant concentrations of such students, they actually get $2,200 less per student. And so we have this really systemic issue of not providing the resources that students need, particularly when we deal with children of color. We too often in our nation underfund those schools. And so it's important to recognize that we still have these widespread disparities in educational opportunity as we think about how might we finish the work of that Barbara started and that your family started in desegregating our schools. And what I want to suggest to the audience is we want to think not just about having integrated schools, but also at the heart of Brown was this concept of equal educational opportunity. And we really don't have a robust definition of that, a fulsome definition of what's supposed to be equal in equal education opportunity. Is it simply white and black students sitting beside one another? That is never what the lawyers in Brown versus Board of Education were limited to in their vision of equal educational opportunity. They actually really subscribe to the idea that green follows white. In other words, when you bring black and white students together, the money, the funding would follow the students, that they would have more equal schools, fewer issues such as, you know, dealing with heaters that are not distributing heat equally throughout the classroom. You wouldn't be dealing with those things if the white students were also experiencing them, right? And so you see some of that lingering today. When you see these funding gaps, you see conditions that most people, really do not want for their students. So I think we have to think about, Brown recognized equal education opportunity, but then the court really kind of did not follow through on it when it allowed for all deliberate speed, when it allowed sort of a very slow implementation. Deliberate in this context means slow, which is how the opening was provided for massive resistance. If we had insisted on immediate and effective integration, we would not have given that air in the room, that space, that play in the joints in the law to allow for widespread massive resistance. And so now, because we took too long to really push back on that, we have the legacy of systemic racism that replicates itself. So until you fully dismantle segregation and racism, it merely replicates itself, right? And so the thing that I really challenge my law students, so one of the things that I'm doing at the University of Virginia School of Law, where I direct the new Education Rights Institute, is when I teach students and work with research assistants and my staff, one of the things that we focus on is that we have to work at the issue in the same way that Barbara and the Griffins and others worked on these issues. In other words, we have to take on the fulsome challenge of there are, large odds really against us, right? We've had an unequal system really since the founding of our public schools. And so we have to recognize that this is a long game that we are playing, that this is not gonna be, there's not gonna be some easy win in a few years. Because even when you got Brown versus Board of Education, there still needed to be many, many court cases after that to even move the school desegregation issue forward. And so one of the things that I really challenge my students to think about is that we must sort of press on in the work in the same way that those who preceded us did. In other words, that tireless, relentless sort of pursuit of equal education opportunity that just will not take no for an answer. So I think one of the questions I wanted to pose to each of you is, as you look at the public schools today, if you were able to change sort of one thing, what might that one thing be?
So yeah, briefly, so I think we focus on the question of integration and and having black kids together and with white kids in school. I've been looking at this for a long time, ever since I was a little boy, and I think that sure, racism exists. As my daddy would say, racism is like rain. If it ain't raining, it's somewhere fixing to rain. But I think that the problem with American education and the inequality results from one thing, and that is that school financing is done at the local level. So the quality of education you get really is determined by your zip code. And so, and as long as we fund public education with local property taxes, there's going to be inequality. And so I would advocate for lawyers and policymakers to start thinking about, you probably can't get rid of that, so it's so entrenched, but to start thinking about alternative and supplemental funding. But the funding is the problem, is tied to zip code.
Yeah, and I'll just add one data point to that, which is that we are one of the only nations that provides less funding to students from low-income families. We are an outlier, and this is not American exceptionalism. This is a fundamentally upside-down system. Other countries recognize that. The research shows that students who come from communities of poverty need greater resources, and so they provide those resources. We, on the other hand, give less funding to those communities. And so we have this upside down broken system, but we can build a better one. So, Joan, did you want to answer that question?
Actually, Actually, I can't think of any one thing that I want to change other than the inequality that we felt during those times. Otherwise, I can't think of anything.
So in other words, finishing the work that we started rather than, right, stopping that work. So one of the key issues that we should think about today is how do we move these issues forward? How do we continue the work of equal educational opportunity? And I know that many of you in the classroom are continuing that work. I think part of it is asking our students, what would equal educational opportunity look like? What should be equal? This is something I ask my law students, but I think students at any age can think about and answer that question. And then it's sort of, when we build a vision of what is equal educational opportunity, I think one of the things to do is to then compare it to our reality. What does our current system look like? How is it consistent or inconsistent with equal educational opportunity? And so as we think about that, it was definitely lawyers and students and educators and a posse and followers who are all working together to sort of build on and build a movement to advance school integration and school desegregation. What advice might either of you give to those who are seeking to continue to eradicate the disparities that were that your sister worked on and that your family also sought to end? What advice might you give to the educators or lawyers who continue to work on this issue? So Joan, I'll start with you.
The only advice I would give to them is to continue to teach the students to be honest and to be think about equity and just try to explain to them how important it is for history to be told honestly today.
Thank you. Skip.
I want to go back to, so as I look now, what my biggest fear is that America doesn't value education the same way it used to. That's my biggest fear. And so I think, I don't know if lawyers can do this, but others can do this. I think we have to restore the American contract, social contract with education. And I think we have to say that education is a human right along with health care, and that each and every American child or people under the care of America deserve an education. And so there's some work we have to do to rebuild America's commitment to public education. So let me just say, my father's real notion was that public education was one of the pillars of of democracy, along with independent press, which we no longer have. And so I think that the American people have to renew their commitment to education, starting with different funding formulas, and this go over well with this crowd, finding out how to pay teachers more money, you know.
Thank you. So one of the reasons I published the book that was mentioned when I was introduced about a federal right to education, fundamental question for our democracy, is the fact that we do not currently have any kind of federal guarantee of a right to education. And again, we're outliers on this. Other countries typically have some kind of federal or national right to education that they recognize. This was litigated in the Supreme Court of our nation, and in a case called San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez, the court held that there is not a federal constitutional right to education. One of the things that we are trying to do at the Education Rights Institute is make people not only help people understand the Rodriguez case, but also to help it to be as vilified as Plessy versus Ferguson. Because without any kind of floor of educational opportunity, we're gonna just continue to have the broken educational system that we have today. So I definitely agree with you that we need some kind of federal right to education that then implicates how do we fund schools, what educational opportunities are provided, So definitely agree with you. I wanted to see if there are questions in the audience for our distinguished panelists.
So kind of along the lines of what you all were just talking about, we were discussing at our table a lot of our challenge right now, especially post-pandemic, is with attendance rates and graduation rates and the value that's afforded to education now. During the period that you're talking about, there was among most aspects of American society this hunger and this value for education and the opportunities that it affords people. Now, some of our schools, we struggle to get kids to come to school, to take advantage of what's being offered. Where do you think we should go about tackling this? Is it an issue of representation in the stories we tell? Is it an issue in the value of opportunity afforded to an education just in society in general? Is it our celebration of celebrity for the sake of celebrity as opposed to like academic merit? Like where do you see that problem best being tackled?
Do you want to tackle it? Do you want to tackle that?
How much time you got? I mean, all of those things. I think that, what made the thing possible and what Barbara tapped into was the hunger in the black community for education. Now, I'm going to say that might get me in trouble with some folks. I don't think that hunger exists in the black community in the same way, and I don't think it exists in America in general in the same way. I think there's a lot of concern about inequalities, but I would like to see a restoration of the hunger for education that, and we came up in the same places. There was a real hunger for education. And we need we talk about a movement for this and that. We need a movement to restore that in America. I mean, I travel the world, and I can tell you that there are countries that are way, some people don't want to hear this, but there are countries that are way ahead of us on the education, the quality of education. And we're going to be in trouble because of that, It needs a movement. And yeah, I mean, I just think that Barbara tapped into a deep well. Teachers used to be revered in our community, and people used to hunger and thirst for education. They sacrificed 14 years out of the community's life to get education. That doesn't exist today.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that several things. So one, I do think that we are not helping this current generation understand the connection between their education and what their life is going to look like later, right? Because we see all of these like YouTube stars and we see celebrities who are making quick money, right? And it's like, well, if I drop out, maybe I'll just be a YouTube star. Yeah, but maybe you won't. And maybe you'll become dependent on the state, right? So setting aside sort of more illicit ways to support themselves, one of the things that we often tell I won't speak for my husband, one of the things I sometimes joke with my kids is like, you have 5-star tastes. You're gonna want a 5-star job, period, right? What's the lifestyle that you're gonna wanna live? You need to think about getting a job that's gonna provide that because I'm not gonna provide it for you, right? And so just that kind of like connection between like, what's the life you wanna live and what's the job that's gonna get you there? I think the second thing is having high quality schools. schools where students actually want to be, where there's, for example, a robust set of extracurricular activities. Some kids, the research shows, really they're most excited about what happens after school. But if there's not a full slate of the arts and sports and music, some kids sort of check out because there's nothing that's really speaking to their passion. And so I think that loss of extracurricular activities and other things is something that, as well as not having high quality learning environments, is something that also discourages kids from going to school. And then the final part I'll say is there's a strong growing research body about belonging in school. And I think it touches on exactly what you said, which is that too often what we're learning in school doesn't connect to who I am as a person, right? Kids often want to ask why. Why are we learning this? Why are we learning this, right? When they don't see themselves in the history, when they don't see themselves in the literature that we're reading, and they don't have that sense of community enough where they've connected with teachers and classmates in the building in a way that makes them feel like they belong, then it's more likely that they will drop out, because there's not that bond that ties the kids to the school. And so I think, the absentee question is a big one, right? I think Skip's answer of how long do you have, there are whole conferences on fixing absenteeism, but those are sort of three things that come to mind driven from the research about how to address that type of problem.
I was just going to ask Joan if you could talk a little bit more about the belonging that you felt at Moton, because I noticed when you were talking earlier, you made sure to emphasize that you had excellent teachers. And I've noticed a lot of your classmates, whenever they're talking about segregation, it's like they're always still want people to know that we loved our school community, we loved our school culture, we had great teachers, they were excellent. So could you maybe share a little bit more about what made your educational experience exceptional despite the clear discrepancies in resources?
Well, I can't say enough about our teachers, because our teachers were so instrumental in pushing us and trying to make us excel. And so I would say all of them were very much student-oriented and tried to work with each student to try to make them excel, because they not only expected you to finish school, but they expected you to go on to college. And they would ask you, what college do you think you want to go to? And of course, I was living in Farmville at Darlington Heights is my home. And my best friend, Ed Welder, and I applied to Longwood College in Farmville. And we were denied admission because of the color of our skin. So we could not go to school there. We had to go out of the area to go to college. I just want to mention also, since we're talking about massive resistance, Virginia, closed the schools. I don't know if you all know all of that, but from 1959 to 1964 in Prince Edward County, just because they did not want to integrate the schools. And Mr. Griffin's father filed suit, and they only opened the schools in 1964. So I don't know if you all know that fact. Just want to say.
Somebody was talking about, I think Vernon Johns introduced me to this concept. I think they were talking about a famous president of Williams College. And he said, if you have a student on one end of the log and a professor on the other end, you have a university. And one of the things, I think I think there's some push to have you develop activists or something. I don't know how I'm interpreting this. But actually, from my standpoint of view, my mother was a teacher. I think the best thing you can do as a teacher is to turn some kid on to learning. Now, if you need this civil rights stuff to turn the kid on, that's fine. But to me, your calling is to make somebody excited about learning. And I want us to have a movement that gives you the resources and the salary so that you can do that. That's your job. If you turn out activists, great. But your job is to turn somebody on to learning, to make them excited. Barbara could do what she did because she was a great student. She was turned on to thinking and learning.
So I just want to thank our distinguished panelists for sharing their stories with us and their insights, and thank all of you for joining us for this conversation.